keep the conversation going and move right on, and I'm going to invite my next two guests to join me here on stage for a presentation and also a discussion on essentially the same topic, which is how we use a space like this and how we use our urban spaces and how we can be creative. So I'm happy to invite, hold your applause until I introduce both of them. Christoph Rauhut, he's the head of Berlin's Heritage Protection Agency, and Carson Chan, he's the director of the Emilio Ambasz Institute at MoMa and a curator in the Department of Architecture and Design. Welcome. Welcome, both of you. And before we start our discussion, you have brought statements that you're going to tell us about as well. So would you like to begin, Christoph?
Yes, I have a small presentation for you, and I can hope that we will see that, and you just have to let me know how I can switch forward.
Sure. I think that the slides will be operated. Maybe you just give them a hint when you start.
Good. So welcome to you all. Thank you for the invitation to this conference. As many of you know, this building was closed for many years, and it is really good to be back here for the conference. And many people and organizations, thank you,
we do have
fought for the future of this building in the recent years. And I would like to start pointing out that this reopening of the building is really also a success of civil society engagement, and as this is really good to be here. And I would also like to start by remembering Ursulina Schüler-Witte, who was with her husband the architect of this building. She died earlier this year, aged 89, and she always was one of the persons to fight for the reopening of this building. And I think she would be very happy to see that we're using it for a conference in this year again. I'm sure you all have walked around this building, but I would like to try to give you some more insights and facts on this building. It was built between 1973 and 1979 by Ursulina Schüler-Witte and Ralf Schüler, Berlin-based architects. Most of their oeuvre is in Berlin, and they won the competition at the time. It is 300 meters long, 40 meters high, 80 meters width. And when it opened, it was really the largest, the most modern, and really successful conference center worldwide. And it is in a number of levels significant. It was built, and I think that's very important to remember, as a sign of international exchange and for free speech and democracy in West Berlin, in the front city of the Cold War. And it was built in the rare and exceptional example of high-tech architecture, which is really a really rare example, not only in Berlin, but worldwide. And for those and many reasons, and many other reasons, it was also listed as a monument in 2019. And I'm very proud to say that this was really a joint understanding of the Senate of Berlin, and I think that's the way we have to move forward. Let me use the time to point out 4 characteristics of this building to you. The first one is it's always easy to reach. And you have to remember that 5 years before this building opened, the airport of Tegel, which was the best way to get into the city of Berlin at the time, opened, and it's just a 10-minute drive away. And at that time, you would drive by the motorway, which is right next to the building, and there's actually an auto foyer, which you would use to enter this building. That's where you would get off, get up through those stairs, and then you entered the building. But it's also important for you to know that it has a very good connection in the way that there is a U-Bahn station very close, the S-Bahn, and this is the area where all those people arrive before they then get into the building. So it's always easy to reach this building wherever you are in the city. The second important characteristic is that you have everything from small to really large in this building. I'm just showing you this one of the smallest conference rooms, and then we can go through to larger and larger, and you all have been to this very fantastic science fictional space. And we could go up. Above us is Hall 1, which can host up to 5,000 people. And there are also a number of rooms which actually allow change. There's, for example, Hall 2, where you can lift up all the seats to the ceiling, and then you have a free open space which could be used for different activities. I'm sure you all have experienced the very unique architecture of this building. That's why I'm only showing you 2 pictures of this space, for example, when it's empty. So you see it's designed from really the smallest bit to the largest bit. Everything is designed, and you have to go to all the spaces to see this very high quality. But you also should not forget about downstairs, because I brought you some pictures when we visited these buildings 2 years ago from the downstairs. There's obviously a lot of space which is used for technique, for service, etc., even up to very large spaces which are used in the case of fire to get out the smoke of the building. And they all belong to this building as well. It's a little bit like a cruise ship where you don't see everything. That's the same with the ECC. I think that's why I made this green. So it's very important to place this building in the conference topic, which we said it's the topic of Zeitenwende. And in the building sector, we are also at the moment we're discussing the Bauwende, which is obviously the same, but for the building stock. And I brought you a lot of topics we probably will discuss later on. But I think the most important is that we always focus on social, economic, environmental, and cultural sustainability when we talk about how to reuse this building. It's all dimensions. We cannot limit it to one. So coming back to the ICC, I have 3 final points. The first one, it's a build brand. I think companies spend a lot of money to have brands. Here is a brand, and we can use it. The second one is its architecture is really a gem. It's so fantastic that you cannot work against it. It's for someone who's a building conservator really also a good starting point. And the third one is the Flievertüt needs to be in motion. And I think I have to explain that a bit. One art historian said the ICC is the Flievertüt of the history of architecture, which and the Flievertüt is a vehicle in a children's story which can fly, it can dive, it can drive, it can everything, but it is always in motion. And I think that's also what the ICC has to be. It always has to be in use. It's like a 24/7 building, and that's when it is successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christoph. That's a really interesting look at this space and some of the rooms perhaps that you haven't looked at yet as well. So thanks for that. And Carson, I'd like to hand the floor to you now.
Great. Well, thank you to the mayor and to the organizers of this conference for inviting me, especially Lutsenka. It's been great to hear the presentations and to learn more about the ICC. I'll keep my remarks short, and excuse me for using my phone as my notes are on here, so it looks like I'm checking email or something, but I'm with you. As Sumi mentioned, I'm the director of the Emilio Ambasz Institute for the Joint Study of the Built and the Natural Environment at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where I'm also a curator in the Architecture and Design department. And so for a conference on the city, many of you might be wondering, what is a museum curator doing here? And I think maybe one way to enter the conversation or to talk about this is to think that architects, city planners, and urbanists produce the hardware of the city, and the cultural industries produce the software. So you really need both, I would say. How we experience the city is determined a lot by how we perceive it. The narratives we build around it is a concern for those working in the cultural industry, like myself. As we have heard many times already yesterday and today, the main concern of the built environment currently is the climate crisis. So when I received the invitation to join this conversation, I was struck by the name of the conference, the Metropolitan Conference for the Immediate Future. And I was thinking, could it be that thinking about the immediate present is exactly what got us in this climate mess in the first place? Humans like short-term, immediate solutions. We need more crops, so then we use more toxic fertilizers, and we don't think about what happens, many years down the road. What we need is not to think about how we provide heat in Europe this winter, perhaps, let's say, but how we can maintain humanity for the next 10,000 years, right? What we need is not to know where the next fossil fuel deposits are, but to understand and appreciate the fact that it takes 200 million years to produce this, and by burning it, the effects will last for another several centuries down the road. So part of what I'm pointing to here is that we need to start expanding temporally and spatially the way we think about the world we live in. We need to think about our built environment not as buildings or objects, but as a process. So in many ways, let's say MoMA as an institution has enforced the idea that architecture is an object for the past century or so. Let's say since our 1932 Modern Architecture exhibition, which really pushed the idea of a modern international style, that architecture should be primarily understood through formal aesthetic kind of design. In a way, the fact that unornamented buildings with strip windows and flat facades around the globe is a result of the success of that MoMA exhibition, its ability to communicate an aesthetic ideology, let's say. The Ambasz Institute, which I direct and which was formed last year at MoMA, in a way aims to undo this legacy. Our aim is to change the way we speak about the built environment, to change the way we understand the word architecture, so not as buildings, not as objects, but as a process. So what do I mean by that? So instead of buildings, architecture is everything from the industries of material extraction. It's the labor conditions involved. It's the political, economic, racial, cultural context of buildings. It's the afterlife of buildings. What happens to all the material after we're done with the building? Do we reuse it? Do we recycle it? Do we put it in a landfill? All this is architecture, and the building is actually one small part of that process. So the redefinition of the built environment has come under stark relief, I think, during the pandemic, when we realized that the world we built around us was not responsive to the changes of the environment. And the pandemic is very much a kind of effect of the climate crisis, right? Cities need to be resilient. They need to be responsive. And so this is, I think, a challenge for all of us, including Christoph, to think about what does it mean to preserve a building in an age of change, in an age of constant change. What is being preserved? So sitting in the ICC, saved from destruction for the moment, is an incredible opportunity, I think, to rethink how we use the buildings in our city. Something we don't often talk about is that architecture in the building sector is the driver of climate change. About 40% of the world's yearly greenhouse gases come from the building sector. So continuing to endlessly build is not the answer, right? So I think as other panels have talked about, we need to be more imaginative and about how we design and how we want to live in the cities of the future. So as we as a community, in particular urbanists and architects, need to be more creative in how we think about architecture and how we design architecture. The built environment needs to be more responsive to the lived environment, and part of that is for the cultural sector to help transition the cultural context in which we have these conversations.
Thank you, Carson. Maybe we can start, Christoph, with a question Carson just asked you. What does it mean to preserve a building when the environment literally is constantly changing?
I wouldn't say the environment is constantly changing. I would say the building stock is actually a very, very stable environment, which is very slowly changing. And that's the challenge we are having, that the cities are built, most of the cities are there, at least in Europe, and they have to adapt to the changing environment in terms of climate, demography, etc. And we have to reuse buildings which if we change them, it takes us a lot of energy, it's very expensive, so we have to reuse them in a clever way. And that's the challenge we are having right now. And I can see that there's also a change where we say der Bestand, so the building stock is really the resource nowadays. For many years it was always something better, something newer would be the future, but now there's a change in the perception, and I think that's a very important change, which actually makes it a bit easier to preserve cultural heritage, because you are set in an environment where the building itself already has a value, despite its cultural value, but it has an economic and climate value. That's the term graue Energie we, for example, use, which is, I think, very important for an immediate perception change in the building sector.
What do you think of that, Carson? I mean, how do you see the aspect of taking and preserving buildings, but also looking to the future and the changing environment around it?
Well, I think, just to respond to what you're saying, Christoph, I think, as you said, when the building was built in 1979, it was a symbol of Western innovation and kind of power, economic power, kind of ideological power, let's say. And maybe we should be preserving that, and the building is part of it, but, to be innovative today is to be responsive to the questions that we have now, the active questions we have now. Prime in those is the climate crisis, right? So maybe this is an opportunity to, maybe by preserving that, preserving the innovative aspect of it, the kind of power that it represented, what it symbolized, is maybe the project. So in that sense, preserving that could mean transforming this into a large urban farm, to provide, vegetables for the city all year round or something, or transforming it into something completely different.
I think certain topics have been relevant for many years, and that's why I, for example, mentioned democracy in regards to this building, because it was built in West Berlin as a sign for democracy in a way in the Cold War. And I think democracy is still a very important topic nowadays. It was discussed yesterday by both mayors. And you're right, I think we have to look for those, I could even say stories, which we could link to a building to make it to a narrative which is attractive. And that's the way how to reuse a building. It's not just the use, but it's the narrative by which you reuse it, because by having a strong narrative, I think you also engage with the visitors, with the people who work there, and make it really to just not just a structure, but architecture. And I think that's a very important difference for me.
I'm curious to ask a little bit also, Christoph, about your role, because you, as I mentioned, are the head of Berlin's Heritage Protection Agency, and that includes and involves many buildings in Berlin. Do you see your role as a study of the past or of the future? Are they in conflict with each other?
I entitled my small presentation, and maybe you did see that, from yesterday for tomorrow. So I see my role as an agent between the two worlds. Obviously, I have to represent what was built yesterday, but I believe it has an importance for today, but also for the future. And I think that for the future is even more important, because such a building is something we have to give to the next generation. Buildings are not built for one generation. A building should be built for at least 3, in the best 10 generations, to make it really useful in the best way. And I think that's maybe the grand story I could put on my job resume, and we also see how important it was mentioned in the topic earlier. How important the history is for the creative sector. I mean, many buildings when they are no longer in use, get reused by artists and the creative sector. So they are the fabric for this creative sector in a way, and this is part of the success story of Berlin from the 90s to now, that there was a lot of space which was also attractive, had some cultural value to it, and people could connect to it. They would get their inspiration of those buildings, and I think telling this story again and again is very important, because we tend to forget it.
Carson, we heard Christoph say that we're moving away from the type of thinking that newer is always better, that we can look at older buildings and think about how to repurpose them. How is that informing the way that architecture is now being approached as buildings are now being constructed?
I think it's an absolutely important point, that for the longest time, the only way that we've been making architecture is through construction. And we have to be more creative in how we train architects, how we think about architecture. Scholar Keller Easterling has talked about subtraction as a way of making architecture. If you take, let's say, a New York City block and you subtracted the buildings, you've constructed a park, right? But so what are other ways of making architecture can we think of? So there's reuse, there's adapting buildings to new uses. And so I think the challenges of the climate crisis and the world right now compels us to find new ways of making architecture, to be more creative, and just constructing from anew all the time is not the answer.
I'd be curious to get your perspective on what you think of how a space like this can be reimagined. It is so massive, but as Christoph made the good point to show on his slides as well, it is easily reached. It is in the center of the city in some ways. It depends on where in the city you live. But it certainly is a big Congress center that provides a platform and an opportunity for so many of these types of gatherings. So where would you put this building in its future?
I mean, I would say that we heard many different ideas already. The idea of a data center could be interesting. The heat coming from the servers can, provide heating in the winter for neighboring communities, maybe. But I think, instead of thinking of different ideas, which we can do all day long, maybe we try to think of a method for coming up with how to do this. And I would say, one thing to think about is to think about the city ecologically, so not just what we need tomorrow or what we need next year, but how we want the city to evolve, in the next 50, 100 years. In the same way that, seeing the need for offices created a lot of office stock, and then all of a sudden with the pandemic, we realize that we don't need them anymore and people can work from home. This is the kind of short-term urban thinking that I think we don't need. So it's a process, right? We don't have an answer, but maybe what we do is find community groups to come together and discuss what's in need right now. Have those communities come together. Childcare is something that we can have groups come and talk about. Places for housing, places for education. So it's about starting those conversations rather than coming up with 50 ideas and picking one, I would say.
You mentioned the ecology as a perspective of a method, how to approach repurposing buildings and spaces. Christoph, I want to ask you, because if you were at Q Berlin last year, one of our speakers talked about how it is not the ecologic choice to tear down buildings, but rather to repurpose them. Are there spaces where that isn't the case, where you have to literally start with a clean slate?
Not in a built city as Berlin. I would say you're always in a setting. I mean, even if you have if you think you have a clean space, there are buildings around it. There might be something underneath it. So nowadays, planning is more about taking all those complex tasks into account and how to then get the most out of it. And I think that's what really is also the struggle, and that's why planning takes so long, that we have so many hopes in a way for what has to be achieved. And I would like to strongly underline what you said. It's not just about the idea. I mean, there are many ideas, and we will hear some for this building later on, what we could use with this, what we could do with this building. But the process is is equally important, and it's actually probably even more complex and complicated to drive such a process. That's why I'm very happy that the Senator Schwarz is willing to do that, because it's quite a task. And one thing is important in this process, is you have to do it with the civil society, and that's what happened here. That's why we're here, because civil society was asking constantly for this building and not letting go on the political level, and I think that's very important. And I would also like to say it's a bit the same for Tempelhof. We need the civil society to constantly ask that the political level repurposes those spaces, because it's such a complicated process, and we are in this process. It's not, Tempelhof is not empty, it's actually in use, but it could be even more in use, and we have to make the story. But the important, while we are in this process, is that we always believe in the story and in the success. And that's something which is sometimes a bit difficult in Berlin. There are many people who say it cannot happen, but as Franziska Giffey yesterday said, we have to make it happen, and that's why we have to be positive in the process.
I think that's a positive message, certainly. Christoph, if I could follow up on your point to ask you, I think many people like me might be curious here to understand the process behind the work that you do. So could you tell us how buildings are designated as getting a special heritage protection status here, and which buildings are not given that status? What is that process like?
It's science in a way. We have set academic values, and to those we research, and we have to describe them. And a building could be of historical value, of artistic value, and you can describe those values very well. Actually, if you start to do that, there's a profession basically, and you always have to add what we call the Erhaltungsinteresse der Allgemeinheit. I have to translate that. It's the public interest in keeping that building, and I think the ICC is a very good example. That's a building where you would have international organizations writing to the city of Berlin that this building has a value and it has to be listed. And that's, for example, one way of how to find this this public interest. And what happens is that once we work on this, it's actually written down, and at the very end of the process, I have to sign something, and then the owner gets a letter, as simple as this. And but we obviously try to work in a systematic way, meaning, for example, that we have been looking at academic buildings of the 70s and 80s in the recent 2 years. As the Mäusebunker is very known in Berlin, but there are others, and that's because we then look at the entire building stock, and we kind of, it's like a sieben. I don't know the English word. It's like a process where you find the very best of the best, basically. And so you start with all the buildings being built in a certain time span, and in the end you find the 2 or 3 best of them.
It's an interesting picture to think of the city of Berlin falling through a sieve. But
maybe just before we end, or to close up, in 1977, so just before this building was built, Oswald Matthias Ungers, German architect, thought of a different way of preserving West Berlin, and he called it the Green Archipelago. And the idea is you use the buildings and the spaces that are there, and the spaces that are unused, you let it rewild, and you let the trees and the animals and nature come back and take it over. And through time, you can figure out what to preserve and what not to preserve. And the places that are overgrown, you let them continue to overgrow.
Is that an option for Berlin?
It was at the time, but now we actually, I think we couldn't go down the path where we do not use buildings because we have to use all of them. We are short of space at the moment. But we did see in Eastern Germany those processes of degradation, and it did also happen that in those processes, cultural or buildings of cultural value were torn down. So, but as a society, we should not go down this path, but rather try to keep cities running and keep using them. As I said, building is a heavy investment economically, but also ecologically. So we have to use them as long as we can.
We've seen some of those rewilding projects in the west of Germany, in the former mining part of the country, where that infrastructure is not being used at all. But of course, in a city like Berlin, that's a very different story. Carson, Christoph talked about immaterial value. How do you ascribe that value to buildings, and how does that change your perspective on their use?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important, the immaterial values. I would say, there are many different ways we can do that. There's the scholarly way, which you mentioned, through historians, but then just through how people use the space and how people view the space. I don't know. I don't know if I can come up with any examples immediately, but if any place, I would say that from mid-90s to 2000s in Berlin, the artistic community has been able to find spaces that they wanted to preserve. And they did that by simply using them, legally or otherwise. And the way that communities are able to ascribe meaning onto places by frequenting them, by caring for them. In a way, I mentioned the Unger's proposal of the Green Archipelago almost as a joke. But I think the story behind that is people use the spaces that they care for. And that use is shown through the buildings themselves. Yeah.
And how important is public access to these buildings, do you think, going forward?
Important.
Very important, yeah. Certainly, that was a big topic that we had in last year's Cube Berlin. Christoph, how much is the fact that a city like Berlin is growing rapidly, and that's most urban centers, if we're honest, and that there's a decreasing housing stock? There are questions of how to make sure that people can actually live affordably within either the center or in a reasonable distance of the city. What kind of pressure does that put on your organization and your agency to think about preserving buildings and the adaptability of a building?
The short answer is a lot. Obviously, the growth of the city is also a threat to the cultural heritage. But we also have a very, I would say, a good process structure in Berlin to try to deal with those pressure, in that we try to make longer processes of planning where we take the wide view first and look for the potentials and also the no-goes, I would say. And by doing that, you can actually transform also areas with cultural heritage and make them more denser. And the Siemens development is, for example, such a example. When it started, Siemens, the owner of the entire area, said we need more space and we need to tear down the old buildings. That was the presumption. And that's how we started. Then we said, well, let's make a planning competition and not say this and let architects and planners prove different and try different solutions. And in the end, they did come up with solutions that were accepted by Siemens as the owner and the developer, and we didn't have to tear down a single building. And that's, I think, the way we have to go forward. Come from a very big perspective and then make it happen in the small.
Carson, what's your perspective on that in a city like New York, for example, this pressure in urban centers of the space getting ever tighter and the need to provide more space, also publicly accessible space to citizens, with the need to preserve spaces as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all comes down to the way that we want to govern our cities, right? So if it's and that are we governed by economics? Are we governed by capitalist are we driven by capitalism, or are we driven by more humanistic values? And that determines how we use our spaces. Hopefully, with the climate crisis, we get to reconsider all of these questions anew, and think that maybe the way that we've been doing things, compel these very questions that, again, don't have easy answers, but we're asking the right questions.
And I'll ask a last question as we're running short of time now to Christoph. I don't think I asked you yet what your preference would be for this space, for the ICC. What would, as the Berlin Heritage Protection Authority here, what would you like to see?
Well, I'm as professional that I would say I have no preference, because all the ideas are good at the first point, and we need to go into the process and see which one is the best for the building. And I do not have the answer yet, but I'm sure there is one.
Well, we might find it soon. Thank you both so much, Christoph Rauhut and Carson Chen. Thank you for your presentations and your time. Really interesting insights. Thank you.
Thank you.